Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome again to everyone. There's 46 of us here, which is pretty amazing, from all over. I want to take a moment. My name is David. I'm facilitating today. We're really happy to have Pamela Weiss here. Pamela, welcome to give a Dharma talk. I know Pamela has come on a regular basis to GBF. Pamela practices in the Zen and Theravada tradition and has several years of monastic training. Pamela received a teacher training from Jack Kornfield at Spirit Rock and teaches weekly sits in the Bay Area, as well as workshops and retreats. She's also a co-founder, or either founder and coach with Appropriate Response, which is a company that is dedicated to bringing the principles of Buddhism to the workplace. So I'm going to turn it over. Welcome, Pamela. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I realize that my bio that you have is a little bit out of date. Appropriate Response is my old business, and it is gone. And in its place is the new website that was posted that includes this accomplishment, which is a recent book that came out, A Bigger Sky, Awakening a Fierce Feminine Buddhism. It really is, as the title suggests, it's a blend of memoir, Buddhist teaching, and social commentary, which, as the title suggests, is kind of about a radical inclusivity, about a reweaving, in particular, of stories of women in Buddhist history and principles of the feminine that apply to all genders. So I think I'll open today with actually first an acknowledgement. I appreciated David acknowledging the place, the land that we are on, and aware that there are people perhaps on this call from many places. But also just to say that today is also the first day of what's sometimes referred to as the Days of Awe, AWE. This is the stretch of time in the Jewish tradition that falls between the high holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And this stretch of time, yesterday was Rosh Hashanah, and this stretch of time between now and Yom Kippur on Monday are really meant as a time for pausing and looking back, taking stock and reflection to allow us to go forward in a thoughtful, intentional, maybe wholehearted way. And this day, or these days of awe, fall in, I think, what's been referred to a lot lately as, we're in a moment. And actually, it feels like this moment that's been referred to has been going on long enough. And it's really many moments. And for me, anyhow, there's been a question of, how do we navigate this? How do we find our way through, excuse me for saying, but, the shit show of what's happening right now? How do we find our balance? How do we stay connected to ourselves, to each other, to the earth? I have a friend who was describing the moment we're in as, the difficulty we're in as being it's unclear whether it's a homicide or a birth. That we don't know. We can feel in some ways both, that there are things that are dying, old systems and structures that perhaps are long past their usefulness, if they were ever useful. It could be argued, of course, that the systems and structures that are starting to crumble have never been useful, have actually always been harmful or oppressive. And we stand at the potential of something new, something fresh being born. And none of us knows, which way it will go. So we do know in the Buddhist tradition that what I'm speaking about is referred to in the First Noble Truth, the truth of dukkha, of suffering, of difficulty, of angst, of unpredictability, of instability, that's part and parcel of human life. And there's a beautiful quote I'll open with from Ajahn Chah, who is kind of the founder of the stream of insight meditation that's come through Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg, the Insight Meditation Community and Spirit Rock Meditation Center here in the West. And he says, there are two kinds of suffering. There are two kinds of suffering. The suffering that leads to more suffering, and the suffering that leads to the end of suffering. So I'd like to speak a bit about how do we discern these different kinds of suffering, and how do we engage with the suffering that is upon us internally and externally in a way that has the possibility of leading to the end of suffering, rather than just keeping the wheel, the samsaric wheel, spinning. In the second half of Ajahn Chah's quote, that he says, there is the suffering you run away from that follows you everywhere. And there is the suffering you face directly, and in doing so, become free. So I don't know about you, but I have found myself struggling quite a bit to turn and face the suffering that is both in me and around all of us. And I've watched my own behavior over the past period of time kind of toggle between like a panicked, oh my God, I need to do more, but I don't know what to do. But like that. And kind of had kind of a frantic energy in it. And then going from that into periods of overwhelm, despair, kind of collapse. And it took me a while to realize that those two things are connected. that kind of frantic energy in itself was in part leading to those places of exhaustion, of feeling overwhelmed, of feeling unable to do anything. And so for me, there was it's kind of a time of reckoning, very much in alignment with this theme of the days of awe. This is what this is offering to us. A time of reckoning where even though, I'm a Buddhist teacher and I've spent lots and lots of years, 30 years plus in practice, and long retreats and lots of other kinds of support to help me feel like I should be able to navigate this. It wasn't very pretty. And I hope that some of you can relate to that, because it's for many, many people quite challenging. Anyway, my personal reckoning caused me to pause and say, okay, wait a minute. And what's needed here? What's needed here for me to be able to respond to the real challenges and threats that are facing us at a personal level, at a collective level, at a planetary level? And I don't have the answers, but the one piece that became clear to me was that, especially in the world of 24/7 newsreel and the intensity and churn of social media, that I was being blasted by a kind of hyped up news cycle that was not helping. And so part one for me was not to withdraw completely, but to back away from that spin. And the second, and the piece that I'd really like to emphasize today, is the need for nourishment, we might say. And I'm going to describe that today as the need for inspiration. You know, inspiration and expiration are a way of talking about our breath, and that we need to breathe in beauty, kindness, and examples of people who are engaging in wonderful things. It's not the only place we can look. I was walking my dog on the beach a few days ago, and there was a pod of dolphins swimming down the shore. And there it was, you know, whatever the news may have been reporting, there was also that moment of being right where I was and really allowing myself to take in the beauty, the delight of what we still can enjoy, what's present in our moment to moment. So I want to share examples of 3 people who I've found very inspiring over the last period of time. And then to speak a bit about how it is that the qualities, the orientation, the perspectives of these people can begin to point us toward a kind of path for how we can walk forward, how we can find our way through this I don't know what to call it anymore, this many moments, this rain storm of difficulty and dukkha that is both terrifying and also potentially ripe with the possibility of something new, something fresh coming forward. So we speak sometimes about mindfulness as the path for liberation. That's how the Buddha says it, that there is a way, there is a beautiful way for the ending of suffering. And he calls that way the practice of mindfulness. And he speaks about the importance of our mindfulness being mindful internally, mindful externally, and mindful of both, of the internal and the external, or perhaps the interplay between them. And so either place we look, there is a way in which we're learning how to be present with our own suffering, our own difficulty, and at the same time, how to be present, how to work with the suffering that we see all around us, with the understanding, as Ajahn Chah suggests, that if we engage with this suffering skillfully, that instead of having it cause more suffering, it can be a doorway to freeing us. So the first person I want to speak about, who's been one of my great heroes for some time, and many of you probably know of him now, is a man named Bruein Stevenson, who's the founder of the Equal Justice Institute. He's a lawyer who defended people on death row for many, many years, and is one of the pioneers in really showing the line of the connection between slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration. And he's an extraordinary person. If you don't know of him, there's a movie, a new documentary about him out called True Justice, beautiful documentary. And he has a book called True Mercy. Yeah. Oh, and there's a movie also of that same name. And he has a quote which echoes very much what Ajahn Chah said. He says, let me back up and say that he created something called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is a museum that is a reckoning with the history of lynching in the United States. And here's his quote. He said, "I'm not interested in talking about American history or bringing to light these horrors that come out of American history. I'm not interested in talking about American history because I want to punish America. I'm interested in talking about American history because I want to liberate America." And so in the same way as Ajahn Chah, he's suggesting that it's important, not just important, but essential for us to turn toward the suffering that's here, that to not either avoid or get overwhelmed by, as I was describing, seeing in myself, but to turn toward and metabolize, digest, to turn, as we do with compost, to turn the shit into beautiful new growth, right? To turn the rotten old parts into something fresh, something new. So this turning towards suffering is in some ways instinctual for us. Our tendency is to back away. And yet there's a way in which it's necessary for us to, in Buddhist iconography, there's this beautiful figure of Kuan Yin or Avalokiteshvara, the one who hears the cries. One who hears the cries of the world. This is the archetype, the great bodhisattva of compassion. And so the first step in engaging with suffering in a way that doesn't lead to more suffering, but that provides a doorway to liberation, is to turn towards suffering with this great heart of compassion. Not from a place of judgment or denial, but from a place of kindness. From a place of understanding that this walking toward what we might prefer to back away from is a necessary first step. So we begin the finding our way through the mess that we're in by kindly and courageously turning toward. And as we go, the next piece that's important is that we really deeply listen, that we take in what's here. And this brings me to the second inspiring person who I want to bring up, and that is a woman named Robin Wall Kimmerer. Kimmer, Kimmerer. And she is both a botanist, a trained botanist, and also a member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation. And she's an expert in what's called bryology. She's an expert in moss. And so she is an expert at really looking closely at the natural world. And she tells the story of having grown up in nature. And so for her to become a botanist was kind of a natural thing to do. And she describes then her shock and dismay in some ways as she enters school and discovers that what botany is interested is not so much in understanding or conversing with the natural world, but in naming and controlling and kind of boxing things up. And so she offers this beautiful interface between kind of Western science and indigenous wisdom. And she says, science polishes the gift of seeing. She talks about the amazing ways in which we can look through a microscope or we can look through a telescope, that science opens us to this seeing. And then she goes on to say that indigenous traditions work instead with the gifts of listening and language. So we see, but then we also need this quality of receptivity. We need to listen deeply. She says that science is able to name plants, but that in the naming too quickly, that we fail to, how does she say it? We fail to hear their songs. That we need to listen long enough to really converse with, to be in relationship with, to be in reciprocity with. And you can fill in the blank here for the with what. She's talking about it in terms of the natural world, which is also potentially a place of nourishment, of sustenance, of inspiration. But it also speaks to suffering, that we need to learn a way of listening in which we are able to turn toward and deeply listen to our own cries. Physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, psychological, to really be close to and be receptive, to be in dialogue with those internal cries. And we need to have the courage to be able to listen, to be in relationship with what we call other, whether it's animals or plants or people. This is a beautiful way in which she encourages us to begin to shift from kind of a dominion over to reciprocity with. It's a different way of engaging, and it seems so important just now, when most of what we have are worldviews just banging up against one another, that there's so much divisiveness and so little real listening, little reciprocity, little wishing to learn and know and understand from whoever it is or whatever it is. And understanding that when we name and label ourselves, each other, our experience, that it can be useful, but it's very limited. We put our experience in a box and give it a name or a diagnosis or whatever it is, And then we think we're done, but we just barely scratched the surface. That this willingness to resonate with the word karuna, compassion in Buddhism, is sometimes described as the quivering of the heart. Can we allow ourselves to quiver as we turn and face, as we allow ourselves to listen? This listening is not a small thing. I sometimes, in the work that I did for years in organizations, I would substitute mindfulness, which when I began was kind of taboo. You couldn't really talk about meditation. These days you can do it. Mindfulness is everywhere. But when I started, it was still, nothing religious anywhere. So I couldn't talk about mindfulness, but I could talk about listening, deep listening to oneself and to each other. So we begin engaging with difficulty, internal and external, by first doing the unusual movement of turning toward rather than turning away. And then after we turn toward, we listen. We engage. We see, can I hear the song of this suffering, of this pain in my heart, in the cry of another? Can I be present long enough to really hear? And as we listen, as we let ourselves be moved, touched, transformed, then we can act. Then we can engage. So that engagement isn't coming, as I was describing, watching in myself, from a kind of knee-jerk reactivity, from a kind of, as I saw for me, a frantic, desperate, panicked place, and then alternately a kind of exhausted, collapsed, despairing place. But can I listen long enough so that that listening can inform me and allow me to take the next step? So the last person who I'll bring as an example of that stepping forward, that I think of her really as very much the embodiment of the subtitle of my book, Awakening a Fierce Feminine Buddhism, an honoring of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who, if anyone, certainly exemplified that. Many of you know she was, very tiny little person, like about 100 pounds. And yet she was so dogged, so persistent, years and years of steady, one step in front of the next, fighting what she felt deeply in her heart and experienced in her life as injustice. I love her example of taking action because although in the end she has had a huge impact, she did it all actually rather quietly. And in a way, she was very clever. I love the story of how she originally won her first case about equal justice, which is that she did it, she knew in some way that it wouldn't be possible for the court to overturn the inequality, gender inequality, if it focused on women. So she had a case that focused on a man who was the caretaker of his mother, an unmarried man, caretaker of his mother, and had filed for a tax break and didn't get it because the law didn't recognize a single man attending his mother as a true caregiver. It didn't see that that was possible. And so she used that as the example to demand equity by the law. And that was just the initial breakthrough. She stepped. After years of being put down, not able to find a job, not able to get work, not able to live up to her, enormous brilliance and capacity. She didn't. For me, she's the inspiration of not collapsing, not allowing myself to fall into despair, but understanding that anything that's really worth changing, anything that is the part where there's a possibility of giving birth to something new, that it requires a kind of steadiness and persistence. And we may not even see the impact of what we do in our own lifetimes. It takes a big sky. It takes a wide perspective to invite us all to do our part. And there's so much that needs to be done. This has been a helpful reframing for me when I feel overwhelmed by, there's so much to be done. Yes. And that's why it's so important for me and for you to do our part and to be in connection, in communion, in reciprocity and conversation with each other so that we can feel inspired by knowing that we're not alone, that all these other people are also doing their part. So I'll just close with a wonderful example of sort of the qualities of these three people who I've spoken to, having a huge impact in the early history of Buddhism. And this is the story of Ananda, the Buddha's attendant and beloved cousin and disciple who cared for him really. Kind of Ananda sort of ran interface between the Buddha and the community for decades. And Ananda is sometimes attributed with being the advocate or ally for the establishment of the women's Sangha, the nuns' Sangha. And there's been recent research to suggest that this story of Ananda, our sort of archetype of Ananda, is not necessarily historically accurate, but it's maintained over these thousands of years, perhaps less as history and more as myth. And yet, mythic truth is a different kind of truth. Historical truth is about what happened to who when. Mythic truth is really pointing us toward a kind of archetypal universal potential in us as human beings. And in this story, I think Ananda represents the assimilation of these capacities that I've been pointing to. So the story goes that the Mahapajapati, who was the Buddha's aunt, traveled multiple times to ask for herself to be admitted into the Buddhist community and was turned down. And the last time she came, she brought a whole Sangha, a whole community of women with her. And she had gone to ask the Buddha and he turned her down. And the women were gathered outside the gates of the community, wailing, crying, despairing. And Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, heard the cries. And this is the important first step. He didn't shut the gates and walk away. He turned toward and listened. And not only did he listen, but then he went to inquire. he put himself in engagement and reciprocity in listening to, learning about. He said, "What's going on? Why are you here wailing and crying?" And they told him, "We want to join the homeless life. We want to participate in the Sangha." And after he listened and he felt the impact in his own heart, Ananda, who was never described as sort of the brightest or the sharpest or the most diligent of the monks, he took it upon himself to go and challenge the Buddha. You could put this in your own context, Imagine someone who is your teacher or your boss or someone who you admire, and you're going to go and challenge them. This was not a small thing for him to do. And he goes and he challenges the Buddha and says, "Why aren't you letting them in?" And he says, "I'm not going to do that." And he said, well, he pins him in a corner, kind of using his logic. "Didn't Mahapajapati nurse you at her own breast?" And Buddha says, "Yes." And, "Well, how can you not let her in?" And he says, "I'm not going to do it." And then he says, "Isn't it true that women can be equally able to attain awakening as men?" And the Buddha says, "Yes." And Ananda says, "Then how can you not let them in?" So he's persistent. He keeps at it. And finally, the Buddha relents. And this is the example of, or the story behind the founding of the nuns' Sangha, in this kind of spirit of radical inclusivity. And so I offer all of these stories, these characters, Ananda, Brian Stevenson, Robin Wall Kimmerer. If you want to learn more about her, there's a beautiful interview with her on Being with Krista Tippett and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I offer these as inspiration. They've been inspirational for me, and I hope that there's some inspiration for you in these stories as a way to find our footing as we look to discover how to keep going, how to take the next step, how to engage in a world that is unfamiliar in certain ways, just the weather. It's literally it feels like the very ground, the very earth and sky and water that we depend on. All of it is shaking. All of it is not how we expect. And so how do we find our way here? Can we learn to discover the kind of, how to be with the kind of suffering that leads to the end of suffering, rather than engaging with suffering in a way that just continues to stir and churn and make things worse? This is, I think, in many ways the task at hand for all of us. And as I said at the beginning, I don't have an answer, go do this or go do that. But I do hope that these words and stories will offer some windows and doorways for you to be inspired and to find your own way, your own footing, your own voice going forward. So I'm going to pause there. I know we're almost at time, but if there are, I don't know how you do this, David, but if there are questions.
Yeah, I think people can just kind of speak up. If it's people are coming on top of one another, then Actually, yeah, I think we'll go for it. But someone does have their hand up.
I see Bob and Asa or Asa. Asa. Yeah. Okay, Asa, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much. The Brian Stevenson stuff is really powerful. Mm-hmm. One of the things I appreciate the work that you've done so far. One of the things that's of particular interest that has arisen for me recently is when I look at women's right to vote, issues of, the abortion issues, or even slavery, or Brown versus Board of Education. Mm-hmm. Or when we look at the environment, and we look at the colonialism in South Africa, the colonialism here in America, we even get to look at the Native American, when we look at the Native American genocide. Mm-hmm. There's one thing that never gets called out, which is the common element to all of these things. I remember working in major corporations as an executive for whether it's Wells Fargo Bank or IBM, and I watched the gay flags go up at Wells Fargo. I'm like, that's interesting. Wells Fargo is very pro-gay, and, gay men going to the country club in IBM. But, if you're white, you're right. If you're black, get back kind of thing. But one of the things I'm realizing, and I don't know if you see it this way, but if we're really going to look squarely what the problem is, not the problem, but a very important aspect that you were talking about to look directly into it. And we maintain our hand on the heart of passion while we do this. But when we look at mass incarceration, 70% of the prison population is African-American men, and they're only 10% of the population. Yeah. And 35% of the prison population is white men, and they're 79% of the population. There's some real skewed figures in housing, healthcare, education, the GI Bill, you name it. And these things are persistent and they're very persistent, and they're insidious, and they're invidious. And the reality is that one of the things we can see with the issue around feminism, we know it's about males. When we look at racism, we know it's about white, largely. And so when we look at history in America, we see this white supremacy. The white is on top. We saw that when the president of the United States was being impeached, and we saw this group of white men in the Senate who are the ones that are going to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg and replace her with some person that's on Donald Trump's list. Donald Trump is America as far as I'm concerned. I don't care what anybody says. He represents America in a beautiful way because he's telling the truth. And people voted for him. And of course, most women voted for Donald Trump too. But we knew who he was before he started. But my point is, how come it's against the law? Or how come it's so difficult for people to say, hey, you know what? We have a problem here. And it's not racism, it's not sexism, it's not homophobia, it's not genocide, it's white supremacy. White supremacy is in South Africa, it's around the world, the wars. I mean, we have to look at white supremacy if we're going to clean ourselves up, I think. I don't know. I mean, I'm just putting it out there. So I didn't know if you had any response to that. So thank you so much for your presence and your compassion and your love and your understanding. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for enhancing so much of what I said with your perspective and experience. And I would say, in a simple way, I agree. I think it's at the heart of it, and that if that's the language that we want to use, that white supremacy plays out in all of the ways that we are speaking of. And I would just add that it harms us all differently. There's different wounding depending on where we sit. So there are places in which we get to be advocates and allies, and there are places in which we get to be on the receiving end of help and support from others. But what I love about what you're saying, Asa, is let's not let's say it straight, let's name what's here as what's here and as what's true. Because we're at a moment where we really can't afford to look away anymore, to pretend that it's not so, to ignore the impact of this in so many domains. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Pamela, thank you so much for the wisdom you brought to us today. And I actually just wanted to share some wisdom that's related to what you said. In March, when this was all starting, the pandemic was all starting, and the Black Lives Matter starting soon after, my boss one day said, we keep hearing about the new normal, but we don't know what's going to be the new normal. And we don't even know when there will be a normal. And it's useful to remember, she's not even a Buddhist. She said that everything changes. And so what I call it is the new now. Each moment is the new now. And she said this at a couple forums, and it's now become, at San Francisco State, every person who starts a meeting talks about the new now. And I think it's a very helpful way to look at things, given what's going on.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
I would like to thank you for the simplicity of your presentation and the complexity of its implications. Early on in your talk, a phrase came into my head, which I'm hoping I can find some resolution for from what you've discussed. People who know me know that I love words, and my head goes to extremely bad puns a lot. And for some reason, early on in your talk, a phrase popped into my head that we are living under a reign of error. We know what person is inspiring that reign of error. And the reign is both words of R-E-I-G-N and R-A-I-N, that we're being inundated with wrong statements about medicine, global warming, and on and on and on. My head is sort of trying to figure out how I can do, as you suggested, facing that reign of error, or those reigns of error. And I just throw that out there. I don't know if there's anything worth commenting about, but I wish I could stop my head from doing these weird puns, because this one seems particularly complex under the current situation.
Well, it is I spoke today about the importance of turning toward dukkha, turning toward suffering. But it is understood as the premise of Buddhist teaching that the Dharma, which at its essence means truth, is the doorway to liberation. And one of the truths that we tend to turn away from most strongly is the difficult truths, right? The truths of climate change, the truths of the pandemic, the truths of white supremacy, the truths of, the history on which this country was built, as well as the difficult internal truths that each of us have, our own personal history and difficulty. And so really what I was trying to offer was two parts. One, which is what you're calling the reign of error. In my own mind, I've been calling it the assault on the truth. There's a way in which, of all of the terrible things that are happening, that there is an assault on the truth itself. And it makes the ground very shaky. And so it asks us each to pay close attention, to dedicate ourselves to being in truth. And as you or someone said, is the now that keeps changing, right? The truth isn't a static thing. And so we have to stay awake. We can't just like, oh, this is the truth and that's the end. No, it's an ongoing living process of staying tuned to what's true now, what's true now, what's true now. And to me, that's the greatest way to counter what you describe as the reign of error. For me personally, it included, I had to unplug from, the sort of 24/7 show of newsreels that were just spinning, whether it was the red side or the blue side, they both were so hyped up that it was hard to find, what's true. And so to push some of that back and then to find these sources of nourishment, things that are nourishing, things that are, whether it's Brian Stevenson or Ruth Wall-Kimmerer or Robin Wall-Kimmerer or Ruth Bader Ginsburg. These are voices of truth. These are people who are speaking to different dimensions of the truth that makes up our world. And so we want to find those and be fed by them so that we can begin to discern and also to dispel the error, right? It's so disconcerting for us. Yeah. It's not, this is not an easy process. And I think in part because of the impact of social media, we expect things to be so fast, right? And that's where, in some ways, to me, looking at the life of Ruth Bader Ginsburg is so inspiring because, it's slow. Slow and steady. There were decades of hardship that she faced to have an enormous impact. And yet it didn't come quickly. And we might even say that, anything that's worth fighting for is unlikely to happen fast. And so this kind of steadiness of inspiring ourselves, nourishing ourselves, turning toward the truth, listening to stay attuned and finding out what's true now, so that we can calibrate an appropriate response, which today might look different than tomorrow or the next day. It's not a static process, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. So maybe that's a good place to pause and send you out. For those of you who are in the Bay Area, we have fresh air, at least for the moment. Kind of amazing thing. I found myself stepping outside and pulling down my mask just to appreciate, something we take for granted so often, that we can actually breathe fresh air, because it hasn't been that way. So this is part of the spirit of, finding nourishment, finding appreciation in small things, in the natural world, in connection with each other. There's a very different level of engagement than responding to the latest dramatic headline. So I don't encourage any of us to put our heads in the sand and, ignore what's going on. But from where? From, where are we responding from? And if we are ourselves spun out or freaked out or in denial, we're probably not doing that much good, which is not an accusation or it's not a judgment. It's just a reality, right? So then we need to step back and fill ourselves up so that we can continue over the long haul, keep stepping forward.
Can I just say something real quickly?
Please.
I just feel like as part of this idea of stepping back and digesting and taking it all in and listening, and then there's this big push towards and then be engaged and engage Buddhism. And for me, I guess a part of me is wondering or asking the question of, can my engaged Buddhism actually just being holding space and just being and holding that space? Because there's a lot of voices, there's a lot of action out there, there's a lot of butting heads. And do I want to just contribute to that? And can I also just trust in the power of holding space, the power of being witness? And I feel like I don't hear that a lot within this context. I feel like everyone's wanting to get active and do, and that's great, but it also just feels like there's an overdue going on. I mean, that's what Americans are all about, is overdue. So can I face my own American cultural upbringing to actually pull back and come into my parasympathetic nervous system and try to deal with my wounding, my trauma, and then how that is, how I can see that in the rest of the world as well. Right. And then just also just be right now, because there's a large aspect of this time period that is about, you got to be in your home. You have to be where you're at. And sometimes it's not about going out and fighting all the time. I don't know. There's just that dynamic that I'm struggling with. So I just wanted to name it.
Yeah, and it's a real thing. I mean, I think that's, for me, inspiration is a great term, because there's inspiration and expiration. It's like the breath. There's a place for breathing in. There's a place for breathing out. And it's up to each of us to find that balance for ourselves. And there are times in your life or mine where really pulling way back may be completely the inappropriate thing. And there are times when you may want to come forward. And I think the bridge, the place for me anyway to look, is what I was just saying, which is where, if I'm engaging, where am I engaging from? And if I'm engaging from panic or judgment or blame, then I don't know that how I'm engaging is that useful. And it's not for me to judge other people doing what they're doing, but for myself. So that's the intersection of those. Can I be filled up enough, spacious enough, nourished enough, that the way that I engage is not just adding fuel to the fire, right? And it's like the seasons, or if you look at the natural world, it's not natural for fields to be growing all the time, right? There's fallow time and there's growing time. And we are nature. And as you're saying, we live in a culture that doesn't allow much for fallow time, right? Doesn't allow much for that pulling in, that quieting down. That's why a period that we're in right now, and it's true in different spiritual traditions, but coming from the Jewish tradition, this is that time, actually, these days of awe. That's what this is for. It's for that. It's like built into the cycle. Same with the Sabbath. It's the same idea. And so that can happen on a day, and it can happen in a year, right? Yeah.
And just real quickly, in regards to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I just feel like there's an aspect where she doesn't even get a week to be mourned.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like
right into the politics.
Mitch McConnell is there, and now we all want to jump into the fray as well, rather than also with 9/11. I didn't feel like there was much time of mourning or grieving that went on, that we wanted to go out and get them. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that aspect of how do we not get triggered by our political schema in order to not also be human.
Right.
I feel so compelled at this moment, even before you spoke, Jason, to absolutely recognize the profundity that I feel right now by the fact that we have gathered together here today as a body. I mean, this is the most auspicious and precious moment of the week, to be here with 40 to 50 people who are focused on something so precious. I mean, just to look, to behold what, we've been doing this for many years, and we kind of almost take this for granted. I mean, I look here and my heart just opens up and says, wow, look what we are doing, in response to what your initial question was.
Absolutely. Thank you for that framing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is David. I'm going to jump in because of the time. If that's okay with everyone and with you, Pamela, if we could I want to just make a couple of quick announcements and invite the Dana and dedicate the merit. Thank you, Pamela, for the signposts to the inspiration and the models. And I also just want to facilitate. I just want to share my appreciation for how you have modeled a certain, your own authenticity for us today. And I appreciate a lot how you started your presentation with just really embodying where you're at and today for all of us as a reminder of the honesty all the time and that turning towards. So thank you. So just as a reminder for everyone, the Sangha is and our speakers and guests continue to be supported by Dana. And so, as well as continue to support the San Francisco Buddhist Center. So we really encourage people to, make gifts in a way that feels right for you to what you're capable of. And there's a link on the website and we can put up in the chat for people can give through PayPal. People can also give by check as well. And want to ask if anybody has any announcements to make off.
Like Matthew has an announcement.
Okay, Matthew, please.
Hi, folks. I'll make this short. Since the time some months back when Vinnie Ferraro spoke at GBF, I've been dropping in on his Sangha, Big Heart City, and this coming Friday, the Sangha meeting is going to be addressing ways to be engaged in the coming weeks with what's happening in the world around us. I know GBF has, we've had many discussions about how we can become more engaged when there's a call to be engaged. So I just wanted to let everybody know that they're going to have a number of speakers next Friday. And if you're interested in seeing how one Sangha is approaching this idea of engaged Buddhism, I know I'll be there. I'll take some notes if it'll be helpful for us. And so thank you. And it's Big Heart City Sangha.
Also happening on Wednesday evenings is the GBF meditation half-hour sit and open discussion group. The link is the same as the one you used today. Come join us. It's an ongoing kind of core group of people, and we get into some very, very meaningful discussions. So, thank you.
Hi, and this is Tom. I just wanted to add that if you've enjoyed the past visits we've had from Eve Decker, where she leads us in chanting and singing, she does that every Tuesday night, sit and sing, and it's also folk songs as well as the chants and stuff. So if you really feel like getting the vibration set up in your body and using your lungs and hearing your voice, I invite you to join. The details are at her website, evedecker.com.
I'd like to just make a practical announcement about how to stay sane and healthy in the age of Zoom. And that is, my boss said, and I think it's really good advice, that staring at a screen for an hour can be exhausting and make it hard to concentrate. And that it's very useful if you feel the need to just turn off your camera and stretch or do whatever you need to do. And I know a lot of people do that, but I thought it was just great advice.
Thank you, Greg.
And I'd like to offer just a reminder, when you consider your dana, that we hope that you consider the window of $10 to $20, more if you can, less as is comfortable for you. And that helps hugely. Thank you.
Any other announcements? Okay, and I'll just quickly put out several months ago, pre-pandemic, there was over a year, there was a group of us associated with GBF that was having monthly meetings, book group, I guess you could call it, specifically in doing readings and discussions around addressing white supremacy and patriarchy, just as the books are just a pathway, as an opportunity to talk and examine ourselves. And I'm interested in seeing if there's other people who would like to engage in those conversations again, GBF folks, on some regular basis of some kind. So I'll put my email in the chat and I'll send something out to the Google group as well to just reach out to me and say, yeah, I'm interested. I don't have necessarily a shape to what that will look like, but feeling kind of ready and resourced and really interested in work, connecting with other GBF folks to just be in conversation about mainly about self exploration and undoing white supremacy and patriarchal eyes for ourselves. So I'll leave it at that. Any other announcements? Okay, we can dedicate the merit. So, looking how there's almost 50 people come every week, people definitely are finding a refuge here in the Sangha, and it's purposeful. And I think with that, it's a lot of merit is being cultivated by just holding the space, but then even us coming and participating in the learning. So let's dedicate that merit for the benefit of all beings everywhere, including the space around us. And with that, we honor the four immeasurables. May all beings be happy and have the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all beings never be separated from the true bliss, which is free from all suffering. And may all beings live in the great equanimity, which is free from all attachment and aversion, and believing in the equality and equanimity for all.
Thanks, Davey. Thanks, Pam.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Pamela.
Yeah.
Pamela, thank you so much.
Yeah, lovely to get to be with all of you. And please, take good care of yourselves, in whatever way or ways to do that, because this is, it's a long haul. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you, Pam.
And thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.